The road stretched ahead like a dark tunnel, endless and isolating. Route 119 cut through a forest of towering pines, their silhouettes pressing against the night sky like sentinels guarding something dangerous. The asphalt was still warm from the day's heat, but the air inside the car felt cold. Maybe that was just the weight of anticipation. The knowledge that darkness here meant something different than it did in the city they'd left behind. Marcus Johnson kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, exactly where they should be. Beside him, Elena sat with her head resting against the passenger window, humming softly to the R&B track playing on the stereo. She looked stunning in her emerald dress, the one she'd chosen specifically for their celebration. 10 years of marriage deserved something special. The dinner in the city had been perfect, candlelit, intimate, the kind of evening that reminded them why they'd chosen each other. But now, driving home at midnight on this stretch of road, something felt different. Marcus had lived in his body long enough to understand the particular tension that comes with driving while black on unfamiliar roads. In towns where you don't quite belong? It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. It was the way people looked at him in stores in Pine Valley. It was the forced smiles from neighbors who'd lived there their whole lives. People who seemed unsure about newcomers like him and Elena moving into the Ridgeview development. He checked his speedometer again. 45 miles per hour. Exactly the posted limit. He'd been checking it obsessively for the last 10 minutes, ever since they'd turned onto this particular stretch of highway. The speedometer was his anchor to reality, proof that he was doing nothing wrong, that there was no justification for a traffic stop, that if it happened anyway, at least he had documentation of his compliance. The silence in the car shifted. Elena stopped humming. Marcus felt it before anything visible changed. That subtle shift in energy, the kind that comes when someone's peaceful mood transforms into alertness. She sat up straighter. Her hand moved to the door handle, then back to her lap. "Everything okay?" she asked, though they both knew what the question really meant. Then came the lights. Blue and white strobes exploded in the darkness behind them, like a star being born. The siren followed, a sound that seemed to split the night in half. Marcus's hands instinctively tightened on the wheel, though he didn't accelerate. He signaled his right turn with mechanical precision, slowing the car as he guided it onto the gravel shoulder. The grinding sound of stones under the tires seemed impossibly loud. He turned off the engine. The car fell silent except for the siren still wailing, its sound creating a bubble of unreality around them. "Stay calm," Marcus whispered, though Elena hadn't moved. "Just stay calm." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The familiar rhythm that came with these moments. He'd done this before, not in Pine Valley, but in other places, other roads. Each time he'd followed the rules. Hands visible, respectful, compliant. Sometimes that was enough, sometimes it wasn't. Behind them, the police cruiser pulled up, the siren cut off. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear Elena's breathing next to him. Shallow, careful, controlled. The officer didn't approach immediately. He sat in his car for what felt like forever. The spotlight from his cruiser blinding through the rear-view mirror, washing out all detail. Marcus kept his hands on the wheel. He knew this was an intimidation tactic. Make the person wait. Make them sweat. Make them understand that you had all the time in the world, and they had none. Finally, a door opened. Heavy boots crunched on gravel. The officer moved slowly, deliberately. Before approaching the window, he placed his hand on the trunk of the car. A standard safety procedure, or so he would later claim. But Marcus understood it for what it was. A gesture of dominance. A reminder that he could do anything he wanted here on this dark road with no witnesses. The officer was heavily built, his uniform stretched tight across his chest, his face flashed in the beam of the headlights. His name tag read Gregory Patterson. His jaw was set in a hard confrontational line. His eyes held the particular coldness of someone who believed he'd earned the right to judge everyone who crossed his path. Patterson's gaze swept across the interior of the car, lingering on Elena's designer purse on the back seat, pausing at Marcus's expensive watch, finally settling on Marcus himself with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "Evening," Patterson barked, his voice gruff, dripping with an unearned authority. Every word sounded like a threat rather than a greeting. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied smoothly, his voice dropping into the measured cadence he'd perfected over years of navigating these exact moments. "How can I help you?" The flashlight beam lowered just enough to reveal Patterson's face fully. His jaw tightened as he studied the inside of the car, his hand drifting toward the butt of his service weapon in a micro-movement, so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus noticed. He'd spent his entire career reading body language, understanding the small tells that telegraphed intention before action. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Patterson demanded. He didn't offer a reason for the stop. Before Marcus could reach for the glove compartment, the words came out. "Before I reach into my glove compartment, may I ask why I was pulled over?" Patterson's posture stiffened instantly. His right hand, which had been resting on his belt, drifted closer to the butt of his service weapon. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. The physical manifestation of a man losing control of a situation he'd expected to dominate. You swerved over the yellow line back by the mile marker. Patterson lied, his tone dripping with a condescending sneer. The words felt like an insult rather than an accusation. Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't swerved. He'd been driving with the precision of someone hyper-aware of his every movement, someone who understood that any excuse would do. But he also knew something fundamental. Being right didn't matter here. "Now hand over the documents," Patterson said, "or do you want to make this difficult, boy?" The word hung in the cold night air between them, like something physical, something that could cut and wound. Elena gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus felt his jaw clench, a muscle feathering in his cheek, but his eyes remained dead calm. He had faced down cartel bosses, ruthless, corrupt politicians, hardened criminals. He was not about to lose his cool over a bigoted small-town bully with a badge and an ego problem. "I assure you, officer, I maintain my lane perfectly," Marcus stated, keeping his hands glued to the wheel, "but I will comply. My registration and insurance are in the glove box. My wallet is in my left breast pocket. I'm going to reach across with my right hand to open the glove box now." Patterson leaned closer to the window. The smell of stale coffee and peppermint gum wafted into the car, mixing with the night air in a way that Marcus would remember for years to come. "Move slow," Patterson said. "Really slow." Marcus moved with deliberate, exaggerated slowness. He nodded to Elena. She unlatched the glove box with trembling hands. She pulled out the registration and insurance cards, her breathing shallow and quick. She handed them to Marcus. He then used 2 fingers to fish his wallet from his suit jacket, extracting his driver's license with the same careful precision. He handed the stack of documents through the window. Patterson snatched them away. For a long moment, he didn't look at them at all. Instead, he leaned his forearms against the doorframe, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Marcus's, a way designed to intimidate and demean. "Nice car," Patterson sneered, his eyes scanning the dashboard. "Pretty expensive ride for around here." "Whose is it?" "It's mine, officer," Marcus said calmly. "Is that right?" Patterson scoffed, finally shining his flashlight on the license. "Damon Hastings, you live over on the New Ridge View development?" "We moved in 3 months ago," Elena spoke up, her voice tight but courageous. Patterson shifted his gaze to her, sweeping the flashlight over her dress in a way that made Marcus's blood run cold. The kind of look that suggested assessment, calculation, something darker underneath. "I was talking to the driver, ma'am," Patterson said, his voice taking on a different quality. Meaner, more personal. "Keep quiet unless spoken to." Something shifted in Marcus's chest. Not fear, but something sharper. Determination, clarity. "Do not speak to my wife that way," Marcus said. His voice cracked like a whip in the confined space. It was low and resonant. It carried the unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to command. "You have my documents. Run them. Write the citation if you believe I committed a traffic violation, and let us be on our way." Patterson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the night. "You've got a lot of mouth on you, Hastings. You think because you wear a fancy suit and live up on the ridge, you can tell me how to do my job in my town? I expect you to follow the law and standard police procedure," Marcus countered, his voice remaining steady and calm. Patterson stepped back. He unclipped his radio from his belt. He brought it to his mouth. Marcus felt Elena's entire body go rigid next to him. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Patterson said into the radio, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "I need a secondary unit out here on 119, just past the county line. Got a suspicious vehicle, uncooperative driver. I'm going to pull him out." Elena's breath hitched audibly. "It's going to be fine, Cass," Marcus whispered, not taking his eyes off Patterson. He knew exactly what this was. He'd read about it, studied cases involving it, understood the implications. Patterson was escalating because his authority had been questioned, and in situations like this, escalation meant danger. The next 7 minutes felt like an eternity compressed into a handful of heartbeats. Patterson didn't return to his car. He simply stood there, one hand resting on his weapon, waiting for backup to arrive. The blue and white lights continued their hypnotic dance across the landscape, turning the forest into an alien place, where normal rules didn't seem to apply. Elena's hand found Marcus's. He felt the trembling in her fingers. He squeezed gently, trying to communicate without words, what he couldn't say out loud, that he understood the fear, that he'd prepared for this, that they would get through it. When the first backup cruiser arrived, then the second, Marcus understood that the situation had fundamentally changed. What had been one officer's ego problem had become something larger, something organized. 4 officers emerged from their vehicles, one by one, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who believed they had complete authority over the situation. Patterson gestured them over. He spoke quietly to them in tones too low for Marcus to hear. Marcus could read the body language of the men as their eyes shifted to the car, their hands resting casually near their weapons. They were being told a narrative. Probably something about an uncooperative driver. Possibly a weapon in the vehicle. Definitely a threat. Marcus kept his hands visible on the wheel. He could feel his pulse in his temples. That particular kind of adrenaline that comes when you're surrounded. But choosing not to run. This was the moment where things could go bad. This was the moment where compliance might not be enough. Where being right meant nothing. Where the only thing that mattered was managing the situation carefully enough to survive it. Patterson approached the window again. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded. "On what basis?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I've provided my documents. I've been cooperative. I haven't violated any laws." "I said step out of the vehicle," Patterson repeated. His hand moved explicitly toward his weapon this time. Not drawing it, just making sure Marcus could see it was there. Available. Ready. One of the other officers moved to the passenger side, placing his hand on his weapon in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. "I'm complying," Marcus said quietly. He opened the door. He moved with deliberate slowness, keeping his hands visible, showing no sudden movements. His entire body was a message of non-aggression, even as his mind raced through scenarios and contingencies. As he stepped out of the car, Marcus understood something fundamental about the situation. These men believed they could do whatever they wanted. They believed that out here, on this dark road, with no witnesses and 4 badges among them, there were no rules that applied to them. And they were probably right, which was the terrifying part. Elena remained in the car. Marcus could see through the window that she was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, watching the scene unfold around her. Patterson demanded Marcus's wallet again, though Marcus had already provided his driver's license. Marcus extracted it with 2 fingers and handed it over. Patterson examined it, his eyes moving from the license to Marcus's face and back again, his expression shifting as he read something on that license, something that made him pause. "What do you do for a living?" Patterson asked. His tone changed slightly. Not friendly, but no longer quite as aggressively contemptuous. "I'm a federal agent," Marcus said quietly. Patterson's jaw tightened. His grip on the license shifted. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the license again. Marcus could see the moment of realization cross his face. Not relief, but recognition that something had changed. Patterson turned away slightly, speaking into his radio in low tones that Marcus couldn't quite hear. The message was clear. He was reporting something significant. The other officer's body language shifted almost imperceptibly. Their hands moved slightly away from their weapons, their posture relaxed by degrees. Patterson turned back. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its harsh certainty. "Federal agent," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes," Marcus said simply. Patterson looked at the license again, then at Marcus, then at the license one more time. His jaw clenched and unclenched. "I need to see your credentials," Patterson said. For the first time, there was something like uncertainty in his voice. Marcus understood what was happening. Patterson had suddenly realized that he might have made a mistake, a significant one that could have consequences. But he wasn't quite ready to back down completely. "My credentials are in my vehicle," Marcus said calmly. "In the glove compartment. May I retrieve them?" Patterson nodded, a gesture that seemed to cost him something. Marcus returned to the car. He reached into the glove compartment. His hands found the leather case containing his federal credentials. He extracted it slowly, deliberately. He stepped back out. He opened the case and held it up where Patterson could see it clearly. The FBI badge caught the light of the police cruiser's headlights. Something fundamental shifted in the dynamic between them. Patterson's face went pale. Not just pale, but the kind of white that comes with the realization that you've crossed a line you can't uncross, that you've made an enemy you can't undo. The other officers stepped back further, creating distance between themselves and Patterson. "I see," Patterson said quietly. Those 2 words seemed to contain an entire universe of regret. Elena emerged from the car, her eyes red from crying. She immediately moved to Marcus's side. He reached out and took her hand. She held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become suddenly unstable. "Officer Patterson," Marcus said, his voice ice cold now, all pretense of civility gone. "I want you to understand something. That stop was illegal. There was no probable cause, no legitimate reason to pull us over. And the things you said and did constituted assault and racial profiling." Patterson's hand had moved away from his weapon entirely now, hanging uselessly at his side. "I'm going to be filing a federal complaint," Marcus continued, "and I'm documenting everything. Your name, your badge number, the names of the other officers here, the exact time and date, everything you said and did. When I'm finished with this investigation, you're going to understand what consequences feel like." The other officers exchanged looks. One of them got back in his vehicle. Another followed. Patterson stood there, his entire demeanor transformed, from aggressive intimidation to something closer to defeat. "You should get home," Marcus said to Elena. He guided her back to their car. As they drove away, Marcus watched in the rear-view mirror. Patterson stood alone on that dark stretch of road, illuminated by his own police cruiser's lights. Finally understanding that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, the drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine and the sound of Elena's breathing, slowly returning to normal. Her hand remained in his, her fingers gradually relaxing their grip. As they put distance between themselves and Route 119, neither of them spoke until they pulled into their driveway. The neighborhood was sleeping, all the tastefully lit lawns dark, all the expensive homes shuttered and silent. Everything about the community screamed wealth and exclusivity, yet neither of them had felt welcome the moment they'd moved in. Marcus pulled into the garage and turned off the engine. For a long moment, they sat in the darkness. That was... Elena couldn't seem to find the words. That was a violation, Marcus said quietly. That was racism. That was abuse of authority. That was a man who believed he could do whatever he wanted because of a badge. He turned to look at her. In the dim garage light, he could see the fear still lingering in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw something else too. Recognition, validation, a terrible confirmation of something she'd always suspected, but never wanted to fully believe. I'm filing a report, Marcus said. Tomorrow morning I'm going to the field office, and I'm going to start documenting everything. Because Patterson wasn't acting alone. What he did, the targeting, the racial profiling, the intimidation, that kind of behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. It comes from somewhere. It's encouraged. It's built into how things operate. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the implications of what he was saying. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed next to Elena, listening to her breathing gradually slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed her. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment of the traffic stop, the slur, that word hanging in the air. That was the thing that wouldn't leave him alone. Because it wasn't just a word, it was a revelation. It was Patterson showing his true nature, stripping away the pretense of professionalism, revealing the raw contempt underneath. In the morning, Marcus called his supervisor at the FBI field office. He requested time to file a formal complaint and to open an investigation into what had happened on Route 119. His supervisor listened quietly, asked a few clarifying questions, then said something that changed everything. "You're not the first person to complain about traffic stops on that road," his supervisor said. "In fact, we've been hearing rumors for a while, but no one's filed an official complaint, and without that, our hands are tied. This might be the catalyst we need to look into it properly." Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a sense of purpose, a sense that what had happened to him and Elena wasn't just a random act of racism, but part of something larger, something that could be uncovered, documented, and stopped. He spent the next 3 weeks preparing his formal complaint, gathering every detail, every name, every timestamp. He consulted with the field office's Civil Rights Division. He understood that this was the beginning of something significant, something that would require patience, documentation, and absolute certainty, because Marcus knew one thing for certain. Officer Gregory Patterson had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career, and Marcus was going to ensure that he paid for it. 3 days after the traffic stop, Marcus sat in a conference room at the FBI field office, with 2 federal investigators and his supervisor. He'd brought documentation of everything, the exact time of the stop, the location, every detail he could remember about Patterson's behavior, the exact words that had been used. One of the investigators, a woman named Special Agent Maria Santos, listened intently as Marcus recounted the events. "This pattern you're describing," Santos said, "this wasn't just an isolated traffic stop. This sounds like a deliberate strategy." "That's what I believe," Marcus said. "Which is why I want to request permission to conduct a preliminary investigation. I want to see if there's a pattern in Officer Patterson's traffic stop history." Santos and the other investigator exchanged glances. "That investigation would have to come through official channels," his supervisor said. "But given that you were the target of a potentially illegal stop, and given your position as a federal agent, I think we have grounds to move forward." 2 weeks later, Marcus had access to the traffic stop data for Officer Gregory Patterson. What he found made his blood run cold. 47 traffic stops in the last 2 years. 47! He began pulling the details on each one. A man named David Owens, targeted on a Sunday afternoon. Cash seized. Patricia Martinez, a nurse driving home from a shift. Her vehicle searched under the pretext of looking for drugs. Money confiscated. Marcus Thompson, pulled over late at night, on a stretch of dark road, much like the one where Marcus himself had been stopped. Claimed to be carrying stolen merchandise. Charges later dismissed. The pattern was undeniable. The vast majority of Patterson's stops involved black drivers or Hispanic drivers. The vast majority of these stops resulted in cash seizure. The vast majority of these drivers had little to no resources to fight back. It was, Marcus understood, a racial profiling operation, being run by a local police officer. But something told him it went deeper than that. Something about the way the seizures were being processed, the speed with which they were being handled, suggested organizational support. I need to look at the court records, Marcus told Santos. I need to see who's approving these forfeitures. What Marcus discovered over the next month was stunning in its scope and its built-in nature. Judge Samuel Clayton, a district judge with nearly 20 years on the bench, had approved every single one of Patterson's forfeiture claims. Every single one. Without requiring probable cause, without requiring evidence of criminal activity, without requiring so much as a hearing, where the people whose money was being seized could defend themselves. And behind Judge Clayton coordinating everything was Mayor Ricky Whitmore. Marcus found the internal memos. He found the policy papers. He found the email threads where Mayor Whitmore discussed the Revenue Enhancement Initiative, the deliberate targeting of drivers who would be least likely to have the resources or knowledge to fight back in court. We need to focus on out-of-state drivers, one memo read. They're less likely to have legal representation locally. They're more likely to abandon their claims rather than stay in town for court proceedings. Another memo was even more explicit. Target demographics that won't have the resources to fight back. Focus on minorities. They're less likely to know their rights. As Marcus read these documents, he felt something cold and clear crystallizing inside him. This wasn't just racism. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was a coordinated, deliberate scheme. To steal from people, based on their race and residency status. It was criminal. It was conspiracy. And it went all the way up to the mayor's office. We have enough for a larger investigation, Santos told Marcus. We're going to assemble a full task force. We're going to start looking at all of Judge Clayton's rulings, all of the cash seizures, all of the connections between Mayor Whitmore and the police department. Marcus nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they were about to do. How long will this take? He asked. Could be months, Santos said. Could be longer. But we're going to get to the bottom of it. But Marcus couldn't wait months. He understood something that the federal investigation would take longer to discover. This operation was ongoing. Right now, somewhere on Route 119, Officer Patterson was probably conducting another illegal stop. Right now, someone else was being targeted, profiled, and robbed under color of law. Marcus made a decision that would later be questioned by his supervisors, but that he believed in absolutely. He was going to document one of Patterson's stops in real time. The following Friday, Marcus positioned himself on Route 119, in a vehicle owned by a federal colleague, watching. He had his personal video camera, his phone recorder, his federal credentials. He wasn't going to be a victim this time. He was going to be a witness. He didn't have to wait long. Patterson's cruiser appeared at 11:47 p.m., heading north on Route 119. Marcus watched as Patterson approached a vehicle, driven by a man who appeared to be in his 60s, a vehicle with out-of-state plates. Marcus watched from a distance as Patterson ran through his playbook. The fake violation, the aggressive approach, the demand for documents. Marcus recorded it all. He watched as Patterson conducted an illegal search of the vehicle. He watched as Patterson seized a small amount of cash, maybe $2,000, from the driver's glove compartment. When Patterson finally left the scene, having found nothing illegal but having stolen money anyway, Marcus approached the driver. A man named Robert Hayes from Missouri. "I'm a federal agent," Marcus said. He showed his credentials. "I witnessed what just happened to you. I want you to help me document this." Robert Hayes looked at Marcus with an expression of such pure relief. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of the scope of this operation. Patterson wasn't unique. This was just one corrupt cop. But how many people had he hurt? How many people had simply accepted that this was the cost of being the wrong color, on the wrong road, at the wrong time? By the end of that night, Marcus had documented everything. By the end of the next week, he'd witnessed 3 more stops. By the end of the following week, he had enough video evidence that even without additional context, it was clear Patterson was conducting traffic stops based on nothing but racial profiling, and then stealing money under the guise of asset forfeiture. The federal investigation moved into a new phase. Instead of being a preliminary inquiry, it became a full criminal investigation. Instead of taking months, it would take weeks to gather enough evidence to present to a federal prosecutor. And Officer Gregory Patterson, who had arrogantly believed he was untouchable in his small town, with his small-time corruption, was about to learn a lesson about power dynamics that would define the rest of his life. 2 months after the initial traffic stop, Marcus sat in a conference room at the federal field office with a task force of 6 agents who'd been assembled to investigate the Pine Valley corruption scheme. "Here's what we have," Santos said, laying out documents on the conference table. 47 traffic stops, approximate total of $220,000 in cash seized, all of it logged as suspected drug proceeds, all of it approved for forfeiture by Judge Clayton within 48 hours of seizure. None of it was ever connected to actual criminal charges. The other agents reviewed the materials in silence. "What about the mayor?" one of them asked. "Financial records show unusual transfers from the municipal account to Mayor Whitmore's personal account," another agent reported. Multiple transfers totaling approximately $180,000 over the course of 2 years. And Judge Clayton? He's been receiving consulting payments from a law firm connected to the mayor's business associates, Santos said, about $60,000 total. Marcus listened to the summary. He felt the weight of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just Officer Patterson acting alone. This wasn't even just the judge enabling it. This was a municipal operation, orchestrated at the highest levels, designed to steal from vulnerable people and funnel the money into private accounts. We're ready to move forward with arrests, the task force leader said. But we need to coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We're talking about federal charges here. Conspiracy, civil rights violations, racketeering. What about Patterson? Marcus asked. He's going to face charges too, Santos said. But he's also going to be our best witness. When we arrest him, we offer him a deal. Cooperate, testify, and we won't push for the maximum sentence. The arrests happened over 3 days. Officer Gregory Patterson was taken into custody at his home. He was charged with multiple counts of civil rights violations, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was informed of his rights, offered the cooperation deal, testify against Mayor Whitmore and Judge Clayton, and accept a plea agreement that would result in a federal prison sentence, but not the maximum. Patterson took the deal within 24 hours. Judge Samuel Clayton was arrested at his home on a Friday morning, taken to federal court in handcuffs, informed that he was facing charges of conspiracy, abuse of judicial authority, and civil rights violations. His bail hearing was set for the following Monday. Mayor Ricky Whitmore was arrested at his office, in front of his staff, in front of the local media who'd been tipped off by a federal agent working with a local journalist. Whitmore's arrest was photographed, recorded, broadcast on the evening news. By that night, his political career, his reputation, and his freedom were all in serious jeopardy. The federal prosecutors announced the investigation and the charges at a press conference. They described the Revenue Enhancement Initiative as a sophisticated scheme targeting minorities and out-of-state drivers. They explained that the scheme had operated for nearly 3 years. They announced the charges against all 3 men. And they made a point of mentioning that the investigation had been initiated by a federal agent who had himself been the target of an illegal traffic stop by Officer Patterson, the very same traffic stop that Marcus had documented in real time. Elena watched the press conference from home. When Marcus came through the door that evening, she embraced him with the relief that came from understanding that something significant had shifted. The man who had tried to intimidate them, who had used that word against her, who had wielded his authority as a weapon, that man was now in custody, facing federal prosecution, facing years in prison. But Marcus also understood something else. The investigation wasn't about him personally. It was about the people Patterson had hurt before Marcus. David Owens, who'd lost his savings. Patricia Martinez, who hadn't been able to afford her daughter's medical procedure. Marcus Thompson, who'd been humiliated and violated on a dark road. There's more to do, Marcus told Elena. The trial is going to take months. But we're going to see this through. The federal case against Mayor Whitmore, Judge Clayton, and Officer Patterson was prepared over the course of 3 months. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Morrison assembled the evidence methodically, building a narrative that was virtually impossible to refute. She had financial records, she had emails, she had Officer Patterson's testimony, which was detailed and devastating. She had the video recordings that Marcus had made, which showed Patterson conducting stops that had no basis in actual traffic violations. She had victims. One by one, the people whom Patterson had targeted came forward. David Owens spoke about losing his savings and the impact it had on his family. Patricia Martinez described the humiliation and the fear she'd felt during the illegal search of her vehicle. Marcus Thompson shared the trauma of being violated by someone wearing a badge. And she had Marcus Johnson, who would testify about his own experience and about the federal investigation. That had uncovered the scheme. The trial began on a cold morning in January, 4 months after Officer Patterson had pulled Marcus and Elena over on Route 119. Mayor Ricky Whitmore arrived at the courthouse in a suit. That hung on him like he'd lost weight from stress. Judge Samuel Clayton looked older than his 63 years. His once commanding presence diminished to something almost skeletal. Officer Gregory Patterson, in his orange federal prison jumpsuit and shackles, was barely recognizable as the man who had wielded his badge so arrogantly just months before. The courtroom was packed. Local media filled the gallery. Federal agents sat in the back. Marcus and Elena sat in the section reserved for victims and witnesses. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison presented her case with precision. She walked the jury through the emails, in which Mayor Whitmore directed the targeting of minorities and out-of-state drivers. She presented the financial records, showing the transfers of seized money into private accounts. She walked them through the pattern of traffic stops, the pattern of seizures, and the pattern of forfeiture approvals. That defied any reasonable explanation, other than deliberate, orchestrated corruption. Officer Patterson testified for 3 hours. In his prison jumpsuit, his bravado completely stripped away, he described the orders from Mayor Whitmore. He described Judge Clayton's promises to rubber stamp the forfeitures. He described the culture of impunity that had been created. where violating people's rights and stealing their money was considered just another part of doing business in Pine Valley. We were told to focus on people who wouldn't have the resources to fight back, Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. We were told to target out-of-state drivers, to target minorities. We were told that Judge Clayton would make sure the forfeitures went through, without any real hearing or evidence review. The defense attempted to argue that Patterson was unreliable, that he was simply trying to lighten his own sentence by implicating others. But the financial records spoke for themselves, the emails spoke for themselves, the pattern was undeniable. When Marcus took the stand, Attorney Morrison asked him to describe his own experience. I was pulled over without probable cause, Marcus said, speaking directly to the jury. I was lied to about the reason for the stop. I was subjected to racial intimidation. I was told to comply with an illegal order to exit my vehicle. And if I had not had federal credentials, if I had not been able to identify myself as an FBI agent, I have no doubt that Officer Patterson would have searched my vehicle, would have seized any cash I was carrying, and would have submitted false reports claiming that I was transporting drug proceeds. The jury heard his testimony. They heard the tone in his voice. They understood. In that moment, the difference between his experience and the experiences of the 47 other people whom Patterson had targeted. I didn't escalate the situation, Marcus told the jury. I survived it because I had credentials that made me dangerous to them. These other people, David Owens, Patricia Martinez, all the others, they didn't have that protection, and Officer Patterson knew it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts for Mayor Ricky Whitmore, guilty on all counts for Judge Samuel Clayton, guilty on all counts for Officer Gregory Patterson. The courtroom erupted. Mayor Whitmore's face went white, then red. Then he simply collapsed into his chair, his attorney placing a hand on his shoulder. As the reality of his situation sank in, Judge Clayton openly wept, his body shaking with sobs. As his entire identity, built on the bench, on the authority of his position, crumbled to nothing, Officer Patterson stood when the verdicts were read, his expression unreadable, but his entire posture transformed. The man who had been physically dominant, who had used his body as a tool of intimidation, suddenly looked small, diminished, finally facing the consequence of his actions. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, at the federal courthouse on a grey morning in March. The federal judge pronounced sentence. Mayor Ricky Whitmore, 22 years in federal prison. Judge Samuel Clayton, 25 years in federal prison. Officer Gregory Patterson, 8 years in federal prison, with a recommendation that he serve his time in a facility that addressed his understanding of civil rights and the oath he had violated. But the practical consequences extended far beyond prison sentences. All of the assets that Mayor Whitmore had obtained through the scheme were seized by the federal government. All of Judge Clayton's ill-gotten gains were confiscated. Officer Patterson's pension was frozen, pending civil litigation, and most importantly, the seized money, all $220,000, was ordered returned to the victims. It would be distributed through a federal restitution process, with priority given to those who had suffered the greatest harm. David Owens received a check that paid off the remainder of his mortgage and secured his daughter's college education. Patricia Martinez's daughter received the surgery she'd needed so desperately. Marcus Thompson received enough compensation to cover the legal costs he'd incurred in fighting the forfeiture of his seized funds. The Pine Valley Police Department was placed under federal oversight. A new police chief was appointed. An internal investigation was launched into the culture that had allowed Patterson's behavior to flourish. New training protocols were implemented. A civilian review board was established to oversee traffic stops and cash seizures. Elena watched all of this unfold. She understood something that Marcus had understood from the beginning. This wasn't just about Officer Patterson. This was about a system that had enabled Patterson, that had encouraged him, that had protected him, until someone had the position and the determination to hold everyone accountable. But the story didn't end with the convictions. Because once federal prosecutors began investigating the Pine Valley corruption scheme, they discovered something disturbing. This wasn't an isolated incident. A review of traffic stops across the small towns in the region revealed a similar pattern in 3 other municipalities. Officers stopping predominantly Black and Hispanic drivers. Seizures of cash with no connection to actual criminal charges. Judges approving forfeitures without proper hearings. This is bigger than Pine Valley, Santos told Marcus during a debriefing. This appears to be a regional issue, possibly even a statewide concern. Small police departments in areas with limited federal oversight running these kinds of operations with impunity. The federal investigation expanded. Additional task forces were assembled. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division began reviewing cases across multiple jurisdictions, and Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time working with federal prosecutors, helping them understand the mechanics of how these schemes operated. How did you figure out the pattern? One prosecutor asked. I lived it, Marcus said simply. I was the target of it. And then I paid attention to the data. I looked at the numbers. 47 traffic stops, all by the same officer, all following the same basic pattern, all targeting the same demographics. You don't have to be a genius to see what's happening, you just have to look. The implications of his words hung in the air. Because the truth was, law enforcement agencies had the capability to identify these patterns. Police departments had access to the same data. They could pull it up, analyze it, see exactly what was happening. The fact that most of them didn't, the fact that most didn't seem to care, was perhaps the most damning indictment of all. As the federal investigation deepened, it became clear just how thoroughly the corruption in Pine Valley had permeated every level of municipal government. Not only had Mayor Whitmore actively directed the scheme, but he'd built an organizational structure to sustain it. He'd cultivated relationships with Judge Clayton over the course of years, establishing a pattern of cooperation and mutual benefit. He'd ensured that officers like Patterson understood the department's priorities, which had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with generating revenue. What we're seeing here, U.S. Attorney Dennis Richardson explained at a press conference, is not an isolated case of police misconduct. This is institutional corruption. This is a conspiracy that involved the mayor, the judiciary, and law enforcement working in concert to violate the constitutional rights of citizens for personal financial gain. The evidence was presented in court documents, in victim impact statements, in the financial records that told a story of systematic theft. Mayor Whitmore had been taking approximately 40% of the seized cash. Judge Clayton had been receiving consulting payments in return for his judicial cooperation. Officer Patterson and the other officers involved in stops had been receiving bonuses from a discretionary fund that Mayor Whitmore had created, bonuses that increased proportionally. With the amount of cash they seized, the total amount stolen over the course of nearly 3 years was staggering. $220,000 seized from citizens who had done nothing wrong, lives disrupted, families harmed, trust in institutions destroyed. But buried in the financial records was something else entirely. Evidence that the scheme had been discussed at the highest levels of the State Police Oversight Board, evidence that state officials had been aware of similar schemes in other jurisdictions and had done nothing. Evidence that the corruption in Pine Valley was not unique, but rather a logical outcome of a system that had been designed to enable exactly this kind of abuse. Marcus read the documents as they were released. He felt something shifting inside him. This wasn't just about holding 3 men accountable anymore. This was about understanding that the problem went deeper than any individual case, any individual town, any individual corrupt official. The trial had brought the victims to the forefront, and Marcus made a deliberate decision to stay engaged with them, beyond what his role as a federal investigator required. He attended David Owen's family dinner. When the restitution check was presented, he saw the tears of relief in David's eyes, as he understood that his daughter's future, college, education, opportunity, had been restored to him. He watched as David's family embraced each other, understanding that what had seemed lost was now reclaimed. He sat with Patricia Martinez. As she described the medical procedure her daughter had finally been able to undergo, he heard the gratitude in her voice as she explained that her daughter would live a normal life, without the complications that the untreated medical condition would have caused. He listened to Marcus Thompson describe how the money he'd lost had represented months of his savings, money he'd intended to use for a home down payment, money that had been stolen. Under the pretense of law enforcement, these conversations crystallized something in Marcus's understanding. Officer Patterson's traffic stop of him and Elena hadn't been an anomaly. It had been part of a pattern that extended to dozens of other people. People with fewer resources, people without the federal credentials that protected him, people who had no recourse and no way to fight back. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," Elena said one evening, months after the trial, as they sat on their porch overlooking the neighborhood. That had never quite felt like home. What if we hadn't had your credentials? What if we'd just been people trying to drive home from dinner? Marcus didn't answer, because the answer was too obvious. They would have been stopped. Their car would have been searched. Money would have been seized. And they would have joined the growing list of people robbed by a system that was supposed to protect them. "That's why we have to keep going," Marcus said finally, "because it happened to people without the protection we have, and it needs to stop." The federal investigation into the regional pattern of corruption took months. Task forces traveled to 3 other small towns in the state. Federal agents reviewed hundreds of traffic stops, prosecutors analyzed financial records, and what they found was a mirror image of the Pine Valley case. In Riverside, the police chief had been operating a similar scheme, though on a smaller scale. In Millbrook, 2 officers had been conducting racially targeted traffic stops and seizing cash. In Cottonwood, a district judge, one of Judge Clayton's closest friends, had been approving forfeitures without probable cause, and the local police chief had been sharing the proceeds. The pattern was clear, the methodology was consistent, the targeting was systematic, and the federal government moved to prosecute every case, to shut down every scheme, to bring every corrupt official to account. Marcus watched as the investigation expanded, from a single traffic stop on a dark road in Pine Valley, into a regional civil rights case. That would occupy federal courts and federal prosecutors for years to come. He consulted on every case. He helped other investigators understand the mechanics of how these schemes operated. He testified in multiple trials. And with each trial, each conviction, each sentence imposed, he saw the system becoming more accountable, more transparent, more willing to protect the rights of citizens over the interests of municipalities seeking easy revenue. 6 months after Mayor Whitmore's conviction, Marcus was approached by federal prosecutors with a proposal. The mayor's attorneys are exploring appeals, one prosecutor explained. They're arguing that the evidence was obtained improperly, that his constitutional rights were violated during the investigation. They're also trying to leverage his cooperation, offering to provide testimony against other officials in exchange for reduced sentence. He's not cooperating, Marcus said, understanding the game being played. No, the prosecutor agreed, but his attorneys are pretending he might, hoping to negotiate a better deal. We want to make it clear to him that there's no deal on the table. He's been convicted on all counts. He's serving 22 years, and that's final. What do you want from me? We want you to testify at the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor said. We want the court to hear directly from you about the impact of this corruption on real people. We want the judge to understand that this wasn't just financial crime. This was a violation of constitutional rights. This was abuse of power in its most raw form. Marcus agreed, understanding that his role in all of this extended beyond investigation, into something deeper. He was a voice for the people who didn't have one. He was a reminder that behind every financial transaction, every forfeiture, every criminal charge, there was a person whose life had been disrupted, a person whose rights had been violated, a person who deserved justice. When he testified at the resentencing hearing, Marcus spoke directly about the corruption that had been uncovered. He talked about the victims. He talked about the pattern that extended beyond Pine Valley into other jurisdictions. He talked about a system that needed fundamental change. Mayor Whitmore's 22-year sentence isn't just punishment for his personal crimes, Marcus told the court. It's a statement that we will not tolerate corruption at the highest levels of municipal government. It's a statement that we understand the scope of what happened here. It's a statement that citizens' constitutional rights matter more than municipal revenue. The judge sustained the original sentence. Mayor Whitmore would serve 22 years in federal prison. Nearly 2 years after that night on Route 119, Marcus and Elena found themselves driving on that same road again. The decision to drive home that way hadn't been intentional. They'd taken a shortcut returning from a family dinner in the city, and suddenly they were on the familiar stretch of highway, the towering pines flanking the dark asphalt, the isolation pressing against them. Marcus felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. His heart rate increased, the muscle memory of fear, of violation, of the realization that on this road, in this car, they had been vulnerable, in a way that no amount of preparation could fully protect against. Elena reached over and placed her hand on his arm. Neither of them spoke as a set of headlights appeared behind them, approaching from the rear. Marcus felt the tension in his body spike, his mind running through the old protocols. Check the speedometer, keep hands visible, be compliant. But the headlights passed them. A new Pine Valley police cruiser, its lights dark, its purpose apparently routine. The officer inside, young, professional, the kind of officer who had been hired under the new police chief's administration, offered a brief nod as the vehicles passed each other on the dark road. It was such a small gesture. A nod, nothing more. But to Marcus and Elena, it meant everything. Marcus's hands gradually relaxed on the steering wheel. Elena's grip on his arm loosened. "We're just driving home," Elena whispered. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. They drove on through the darkness, but something fundamental had changed. The road was still dark, the forest still pressed in around them. The isolation was still there. But the sense of danger, the knowledge that they were targeted, that they were vulnerable to abuse, that was gone. Justice had been delivered. The system had been held accountable. And though the scars remained, though the fear still surfaced from time to time, Marcus and Elena could finally understand that what had happened to them had not been random. It had been documented, it had been prosecuted, it had been stopped. In the months following the convictions, the town of Pine Valley underwent a transformation that nobody could have predicted or prevented. Not a comfortable transformation, uncomfortable in fact, confrontational, but necessary. The new police chief, a woman named Sandra Williams, brought in officers from outside the region and implemented training programs focused on civil rights, implicit bias, and constitutional law. She established a policy that every traffic stop would be recorded by body camera and in-car camera. She implemented a system where any traffic stop that resulted in a cash seizure would require extensive documentation and would be subject to review by the district attorney. The Civilian Review Board met monthly, and for the first time, residents had a voice in how their police department operated. When a traffic stop seemed questionable, residents could bring it before the board. When patterns emerged, they could demand investigation. Judge Clayton's replacement, a federal judge assigned temporarily to the district, while a permanent appointment was made, reviewed every case involving asset forfeiture that Judge Clayton had approved. Of the 73 forfeitures he'd rubber-stamped, 68 were found to have been unconstitutional and illegal. The money was ordered returned. The cases were dismissed. Mayor Whitmore's replacement, elected in a special election held in the wake of the scandal, implemented strict oversight of the police budget. No more discretionary funds that could be used to pay bonuses for seizures. No more revenue enhancement initiatives. The police department's budget would be set by the city council, approved by the public, and audited quarterly. The changes were painful. They were difficult. They required the people of Pine Valley to confront the reality that their police department had been committing violations of constitutional rights. But the changes worked. Complaints about profiling dropped to near zero. The number of traffic stops decreased by 60%, reflecting a move toward actual community policing rather than revenue generation. The relationship between residents and the police department, particularly among the minority communities that had been targeted, began to heal slowly. It wasn't perfect. Perfection was impossible, but it was better. It was accountable. It was what justice looked like when the system actually functioned as intended. In the year following the convictions, a federal task force published a comprehensive report on the regional pattern of corruption that the Pine Valley case had uncovered. The report detailed similar operations in 7 municipalities across the state. It identified approximately 400 traffic stops that appeared to be racially motivated. It documented approximately $800,000 in cash that had been seized without probable cause and distributed to corrupt officials. It recommended comprehensive reform of the state's civil asset forfeiture laws. It recommended training for all police officers on constitutional rights and racial profiling. It recommended that any traffic stop resulting in a seizure of more than $1,000 be recorded and subject to independent review. Most significantly, it recommended a change in state law that would require a conviction before any civil asset forfeiture could proceed. The days of law enforcement agencies using forfeiture as a revenue generation tool were effectively over. The reforms took time to implement. There was resistance from law enforcement agencies that had become dependent on the revenue. There were arguments about states' rights and federal overreach, but the momentum once established could not be stopped. The public understood now. The media had covered the stories. Victims had testified. The truth was undeniable. Officer Gregory Patterson served his 8 years in federal prison. He participated in the civil rights education program that had been mandated as part of his sentence. When he was released, he was a broken man, stripped of his badge, his pension lost, his freedom conditional on maintaining his record. Mayor Ricky Whitmore appealed his conviction. The appeals went through the federal system, through multiple courts, through years of litigation. In the end, his conviction stood. He served his 22 years in federal prison, knowing that he would be 78 years old when he was released. Judge Samuel Clayton's conviction was also upheld on appeal. His 25-year sentence stood. He died in federal prison at age 84, never seeing freedom again. His final years spent understanding that his legacy would not be the decades he'd spent on the bench, but the years he'd spent profiting from corruption and abuse of authority. David Owens used his restitution settlement to start a small business. 10 years later, it was thriving, employing dozens of people in the community. Patricia Martinez's daughter became a doctor, specializing in pediatric medicine. Her life trajectory completely changed by the surgery that Marcus's investigation had made possible. Marcus Thompson went back to school and became a civil rights attorney, dedicating his career to helping people who had been victims of police abuse and constitutional violations. And Marcus Johnson continued his work with the FBI, eventually becoming the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Regional Field Office. He trained agents on how to recognize patterns of corruption. He developed protocols for investigating traffic stops and cash seizures. He made it his life's work to ensure that what had happened in Pine Valley never happened again, that the system would be held accountable, that violations would be prosecuted, and that victims would find justice. Elena became a consultant to cities and law enforcement agencies, seeking to implement civil rights reforms. She worked with police departments to understand implicit bias and racial profiling. She testified before state legislatures about the impact of corruption on communities. Together, Marcus and Elena built a life on the foundation of justice, not revenge, not punishment for its own sake, but accountability. The understanding that when power is abused, there must be consequences. That when rights are violated, they must be restored. That when corruption flourishes, it must be stopped. They returned to Route 119 many times in the years that followed, sometimes at night, sometimes with their children. Who would ask what had happened on this road? And Marcus and Elena would tell them the story, not to frighten them, but to teach them, to help them understand that their rights mattered, that their dignity mattered, that speaking out against injustice, even when it was difficult, even when it was scary, could change things. The road through Pine Valley is still dark at night. The forest still presses in from both sides, but it's not a place of fear anymore. It's a place where people can drive without wondering if they'll be targeted, without worrying that their constitutional rights will be violated. It's a place where the police are there to protect, not to prey. And that transformation, that change from a place of abuse to a place of accountability and justice, began with one couple on one dark road, who decided that what happened to them could not be allowed to continue happening to others. Justice is not swift. Justice is not easy. Justice requires documentation and courage, and a willingness to pursue truth even when the powerful stand against you. But when justice finally comes, when the system finally works, when accountability is finally delivered, it resonates far beyond the original case. It creates change. It creates accountability. It creates the foundation for a system that actually protects people rather than exploiting them. That is the true legacy of the night Marcus Johnson was pulled over on Route 119. Not the conviction of 3 men, not the recovery of stolen money, not even the reforms that followed. The true legacy is the understanding that vigilance matters, that documentation matters, that refusing to accept injustice, even when you have the power to walk away, even when justice would benefit you and nobody else, that matters. That one person armed with truth and determination can create change. That extends far beyond their own experience. Marcus and Elena understood that they had been given something precious, not just protection, but also responsibility. The responsibility to fight for people without that protection. The responsibility to ensure that what happened to them didn't happen to anyone else. The responsibility to make sure that the system, when held accountable, actually worked. They lived that responsibility for the rest of their lives. And in doing so, they transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of other people who would never be targeted, never be violated, never be robbed by the system that was supposed to protect them. That is justice, not punishment, not revenge, but transformation, change, the understanding that the world can be different, and the commitment to making it so.